3:17 hours, February 14, 1943. The snow along the northern edge of the Donets Basin had hardened into a gray crust that cracked under artillery concussion like thin glass. The temperature hung near -20, cold enough that breath froze on wool scarves, and the oil inside rifle bolts thickened to the speed of sap. A shallow defensive line cut across a low ridge overlooking an open field nearly 400 meters wide, the ground broken only by fence posts buried in ice and the black ribs of burned farm carts. Somewhere beyond the darkness, an entire Soviet battalion was forming for assault. The first warning was not sound but vibration, a distant trembling that moved through frozen soil and into the ribs of the men lying prone behind the ridge. When the artillery finally arrived, it came without adjustment. Shells struck long and short, throwing columns of frozen dirt 30 meters high, then walking slowly toward the German line. The explosions were duller in the cold, muffled as if wrapped in cloth, yet the concussion pressed the lungs flat. Telephone wire snapped. One of the forward foxholes disappeared completely, replaced by a smoking crater that filled instantly with drifting snow. Orders could no longer be heard. Only the whistle of fragments and the brittle hiss of ice falling back to earth. Behind a low mound of sandbags darkened by soot, an MG-42 rested on its bipod, barrel already filmed with frost. The assistant gunner was gone, killed sometime during the night barrage that had never fully stopped, leaving one soldier alone with the weapon, 3 ammunition belts, and a field of white emptiness that would soon be moving. He was 23, from a machine shop near Kassel, hands permanently scarred by metal filings. His name was unimportant to the battlefield. What mattered was the arc of fire stretching left to right across 200 meters of open ground. The barrage lifted at 3:29. Silence did not return. Instead came the low human sound of many boots moving through snow. Shapes formed at the far edge of the field, first shadows, then ranks. Soviet infantry advanced in dispersed lines, rifles slung forward, some carrying light machine guns, others dragging sledges of ammunition. Their officers pushed them at a steady walking pace, meant to preserve strength for the final rush. Distance, 300 meters. Visibility, poor but sufficient. Wind, light from the east, carrying breath vapor sideways in thin gray streaks. The lone gunner waited. Doctrine said to hold fire until the enemy reached effective range. Experience said the first burst must break momentum. His fingers rested on the charging handle, numb even inside gloves with the tips cut away. He counted steps instead of seconds. At 200 meters, the Soviet line thickened as more men emerged from darkness. At 180, a flare rose somewhere to the south, bathing the field in green light, and exposing everything: faces, rifles, the untouched smoothness of snow about to be destroyed. He pulled the trigger. The MG-42 answered with its tearing metallic roar, a sound so fast it became continuous, like fabric ripping across the sky. The recoil drove into his shoulder in violent pulses. Tracer rounds reached outward in a flat red stream, stitching across the front rank. Men fell not singly but in sudden clusters, momentum collapsing into the snow. He shifted slightly right, then left, walking the fire the way he had been taught on training ranges that never smelled of blood. The first belt emptied in less than 10 seconds. He changed it by touch, movements automatic despite shaking fingers, then fired again before the enemy could reorganize. Return fire came quickly. Rifle bullets snapped overhead, some striking the sandbags with soft thuds. A light machine gun opened from the Soviet right flank, its slower rhythm searching for the muzzle flash. Snow jumped around the German position in small, violent spurts. One round tore through the sleeve of his greatcoat without touching skin. Another shattered the wooden ammunition box beside him. He did not look down. Distance close to 120 meters. He shortened his bursts now, 3 seconds, pause, 3 seconds again, conserving what little ammunition remained. Each pause felt like stepping off a cliff. During one silence he heard shouting in Russian, urgent and rising, followed by the sudden surge of an assault group breaking into a run. He shifted the MG-42 fully left and held the trigger longer than planned. The barrel glowed faintly, heat turning frost into steam. The charging handle burned his palm when he cleared a partial misfeed. He tasted metal and realized he had bitten through the inside of his cheek. At 90 meters, artillery from the German rear finally answered, shells screaming overhead to detonate among the advancing infantry. The explosions were closer now, more violent, tearing black wounds into the white field. For a moment the Soviet attack hesitated. The gunner used that hesitation, firing low, forcing men to crawl where they lost speed and formation. Ammunition belt 2 ran dry, only one remained. He fed it carefully, aligning each round despite trembling vision. Smoke drifted across the ridge, stinging his eyes. The wind shifted, carrying with it the smell of explosives and something heavier underneath. When he looked up again, figures were already within 70 meters, moving through shell holes, using bodies and debris for cover. One soldier rose to throw a grenade but fell backward before the arm completed its arc. Another crawled forward, dragging a wounded comrade whose boots carved twin lines in the snow. The final belt began to feed, sound lost meaning after that. The MG-42's rate of fire erased individual shots, turning time into vibration. He fired until the barrel shimmered, then swapped to the spare with clumsy haste, nearly dropping it into the snow. A bullet struck the receiver housing, ringing like a hammer on steel but failing to penetrate. Fragments peppered his face, drawing thin lines of warmth that cooled instantly in the air. He did not feel pain yet. Only pressure, only the narrowing tunnel of the sights. At 50 meters, the surviving Soviet infantry tried one last rush. They rose together, shouting, boots slipping on churned ice. He met them with the longest burst of the night. When the belt finally ended, the weapon clicked dry in a silence so sudden it felt unreal. Smoke drifted forward across a field now scattered with dark shapes half buried in snow. No one moved. For several seconds he remained frozen behind the empty gun, fingers still tight on the trigger that no longer answered. The battlefield had fallen into a quiet deeper than before the attack, broken only by distant artillery miles away. Breath clouds lifted slowly into the pale hint of dawn. He waited for the next wave, certain it would come. It did not. Instead, from somewhere beyond the bodies, a single rifle fired blindly, the shot passing high overhead. Then nothing again. The wind carried loose snow across the open ground, softening edges, covering faces. The gunner tried to stand and felt his left leg fail beneath him. Only then did he notice the dark wetness spreading through the fabric above his knee, already freezing stiff. He sank back behind the sandbags, the empty MG-42 resting across his lap, and listened to the silence that followed an entire battalion's broken advance. Dawn never truly broke. It was just a slow thinning of the dark, revealing shapes on the eastern front that held no warmth. The horizon turned the color of cold steel. Frost had formed on my eyelashes, on the very edges of my machine gun's receiver. Below the ridge, the field was a frozen tableau, still and silent. The fallen soldiers lay exactly where their last burst of momentum had ended. A fine, dry snow began to drift again, whispering as it brushed against my uniform and skin. The silence was absolute, so complete that the faint ticking sound of the cooling machine gun barrel felt unnaturally loud. I pressed a gloved hand to my thigh. The wool was soaked through, hardened into a block of ice. I knew I was bleeding, but the cold was deceptive. It slowed everything, even the pain, which came in distant, detached pulses, as if it were happening to someone else. My mind automatically searched for my assistant gunner, the man who should have been right beside me. Then I remembered. The crater, the night had simply erased him. I was alone. No stretcher bearers arrived. No new orders came through. I couldn't see our defensive line to either side. Was it still there, or was it gone, just like my partner? Minutes stretched into an eternity. The cold made even thinking a struggle. Then, finally, movement. Far to my left, I saw two figures, Soviet soldiers. They were crawling cautiously among the bodies, their rifles slung over their backs. They weren't attacking. They were searching for survivors, for weapons. From this distance, they were just small shapes, half hidden by the swirling snow. I watched them, my hand resting on the empty MG-42. Even if I had a single bullet left, I wasn't sure I had the strength to fire. One of them paused, his gaze sweeping across the ridge where I lay. He then started dragging a wounded man back towards cover. A flicker of instinct told me to stop them, but it died as quickly as it came. The battle that had raged all night was over. This wasn't about violence anymore. It was about endurance. I tried to stand again, but my leg wouldn't respond. A deep numbness was creeping up from my hip, a dangerous quiet spreading through my body. My training screamed at me, bind the wound, stay awake, move if you can. But reality was just frozen ground and fading strength. With stiff, clumsy fingers, I unbuckled my belt and tightened it high on my thigh, pulling until my vision blurred at the edges. My breath came in shallow puffs, smaller clouds in the frigid air. Then, a sound. Behind the ridge, an engine coughed to life. It was German. I recognized its uneven rhythm. Voices followed, hesitant and disbelieving. The crunch of boots on crusted snow grew closer. 2 of our infantrymen appeared, their rifles at the ready. Their eyes widened as they saw the field of bodies below. One of them swore, a soft, shocked sound. The other knelt beside me, his words muffled, like I was hearing them from underwater. His hands were quick but careful as he checked the wound. I felt the prick of a morphine syringe through my uniform. A strange warmth spread through my chest, not heat, but a feeling of distance, pushing the pain farther and farther away. They lifted me onto a makeshift stretcher, just 2 rifles and a shelter half. The movement sent a dull shock through my body, and then nothing. As they carried me away, the ridge, my machine gun, and the silent field disappeared from view. I knew the snow would soon cover the MG-42. The snow covered everything, eventually. The aid station was in the cellar of a shattered farmhouse, about 2 kilometers back from the line. Candles flickered, their smoke pooling beneath the cracked ceiling beams. Wounded men lay shoulder to shoulder on straw darkened by melted frost and blood. A surgeon worked without stopping, his sleeves stiff with frozen gore, his instruments laid out in neat, impossible rows amidst the chaos. When they brought me in, he glanced at my leg, then at my face, and made a decision in a matter of seconds. More morphine. The sound of scissors cutting through my uniform. The distant sensation of hands moving quickly. He knew the cold had bought me a chance, but that was all it was. A chance. Outside, the war rumbled on, the distant artillery indifferent to who lived or died. I drifted in and out of consciousness. In one lucid moment, I heard someone describing the attack we had stopped. An entire enemy battalion halted before they even reached our wire. It felt unreal, like they were talking about another man, another battle. Then I'd slip away again, hearing only the scrape of metal tools and the tired murmurs of the medics. Days blurred together. They moved us at night, in trucks lurching down rutted roads, engines kept low to avoid drawing fire. The hospitals further west were filled with rows of iron beds. The windows were painted blue to protect against bombing raids. I'd hear surgeons arguing quietly over X-rays, debating how to save limbs damaged by shrapnel and frostbite. Infection was a constant, unseen enemy, hovering over every bed. But through it all, one memory stayed sharp, the vibrating kick of the MG-42 in my hands, the dark shapes advancing through the snow, and the sudden, overwhelming silence when it all stopped. Spring was late that year. Even in March, ice still clung to the shadows. News from the front was a confusing mess of advances and retreats, names of villages we'd never heard of becoming suddenly vital. The field where the battalion fell was fought over more than once. Each side buried its dead when they could. No one ever mentioned my machine gun again. Slowly I learned to stand with a cane. My steps were cautious, a constant negotiation with pain and balance. My leg healed shorter than it was before. Somewhere, in an office far from the snow and blood, paperwork was being filed. They talked about medals. When one was finally placed in my hand, The metal felt hollow, strangely light. It made no sound. It carried no weight of the battle. Only memory. Years later, long after the war was over and the world had moved on, the winter would still bring it all back. Not the roar of the guns or the chaos of the fight, but the silence that followed. The vast white field under a steel-gray sky. The unmoving shapes in the snow. The sight of my own breath hanging in the frozen air. I learned that survival carries its own burden, a quiet weight that, in times of peace, can feel even heavier than it did in war. Long after the war had collapsed into history, winter still returned with the same quiet persistence. Snow fell in slow, patient layers that softened rooftops, buried roads, and erased the sharp edges of the world. He would sit near the window of a small room warmed by a coal stove that clicked and settled as the metal expanded, his hands resting on the table, fingers stiff whenever the temperature dropped. The leg never truly healed. Pain had not faded with time. It had simply become familiar, a constant presence that no longer needed to announce itself. There were no photographs from the ridge, no preserved map with a circle drawn around the place where an entire battalion had stopped moving. Only memory remained, and memory was unreliable in peaceful years. Some details grew sharper: the tearing sound of the MG-42, the frozen air burning in his lungs, the sudden stillness after the last belt ran dry. Other details dissolved completely, like faces seen through falling snow. He could no longer remember the names of the men who had carried him from the line. He wondered sometimes if they had survived the months that followed. War had a way of erasing answers before questions were even asked. The medal stayed hidden in a drawer wrapped in cloth. When officials had handed it to him, their voices were formal, respectful, certain that recognition meant something permanent. But metal carried no weight compared to silence. He had accepted it because refusal would have required explanation, and explanation would have required words he did not possess. Courage, heroism, sacrifice, those belonged to speeches and newspapers. What he remembered was simpler and colder. A weapon that needed firing, a field that needed holding, a moment in which leaving had not been possible. Years passed with the steady rhythm of ordinary life. Factories reopened. Children grew in streets where rubble had once stood. Conversations turned toward work, food, weather, anything that belonged to the present instead of the past. He learned to walk without the cane for short distances, though the effort left him exhausted. On certain mornings, when frost covered the ground and the sky held the same pale color as that February dawn, he felt the old tension return to his chest, as if the body remembered before the mind did. Sleep was never entirely peaceful. Some nights he woke suddenly, certain he had heard the distant concussion of artillery. The room would be dark, silent except for his own breathing. Yet the sensation lingered, the expectation that something terrible was about to begin. He would lie still until the feeling passed, watching faint moonlight trace the outline of the window. Eventually exhaustion would pull him back into shallow dreams, where snow fell endlessly across an empty field. He rarely spoke about the war. When people asked, he answered briefly, choosing facts without emotion. Dates, places, injuries, nothing more. Most listeners seemed satisfied with so little, perhaps relieved that the story did not continue. Those who pressed further encountered only quiet. It was not secrecy that stopped him. It was the understanding that words could not carry the weight of what had happened in a few frozen minutes on a nameless ridge. Once, many years later, he traveled east with a group of former soldiers and officials who wished to see the old battlefields. The journey took days by train through landscapes, rebuilt yet strangely unchanged. Villages stood where villages had always stood. Rivers followed the same slow curves through open land. Only the absence of destruction felt unfamiliar. When they finally reached the region where the fighting had once surged back and forth, snow again covered the ground, thin and windswept. No marker showed the exact position of the ridge. Maps had shifted, roads had been redrawn. Fields merged into one another without boundaries. He stepped down from the vehicle with careful balance, leaning slightly as he walked into the open whiteness. The others spoke quietly behind him, their voices distant, respectful. He moved forward alone until the sounds faded. For a long moment he simply stood there. Wind brushed across the snow in soft currents, lifting crystals that glittered briefly before settling again. The land looked smaller than he remembered. Or perhaps memory had made everything larger: fear, distance, the number of approaching figures. Nothing in the present landscape suggested violence. No craters. No broken carts. No scattered equipment frozen in place. Only an empty field stretching beneath a pale winter sky. He tried to imagine the sound of the machine gun again, but the past refused to return completely. What remained instead was the silence afterward, vast and unmistakable. It felt the same even now, decades later, the sense that something irreversible had occurred, leaving behind a quiet too deep to measure. He did not search for the exact spot where he had lain. Precision no longer mattered. The ground held too many memories belonging to too many men, on both sides of the field. Some had never left. Snow had covered them just as gently as it covered everything else. After a while he turned back toward the others. No words were exchanged. None were needed. They returned to the vehicle, doors closing with dull, ordinary sounds that belonged to peace rather than war. As the engine started and the landscape began to move slowly past the windows, he kept his eyes on the fading white horizon until distance erased it. The years that followed were quieter still. Age brought a different kind of slowness, softer than injury, but just as certain. Movements became careful. Days passed with little change. Winter continued to arrive on schedule, each snowfall resembling the last. Sometimes he would sit by the window and watch the flakes descend through fading light, feeling neither sorrow nor pride, only recognition. In the end, memory settled the way snow settles over a battlefield, gradually, silently, until sharp edges disappeared. What remained was not the violence, nor the noise, nor even the fear. It was the stillness that followed a moment when survival had balanced on the narrowest possible edge. A single machine gun, an entire battalion, and afterward, the silence that never truly ended.